Ernest Becker's 1973 work, The Denial of Death, argues that human character and human civilization are both defense mechanisms created to protect ourselves from facing our own mortality, our own fear of death. Becker writes that the idea of death, the fear of it, haunts the human animal like nothing else. It is a mainspring of human activity designed largely to avoid the fatality of death, to overcome it by denying in some way that it is the final destiny for man. So, according to Becker, this fear of death is an inherent part of the human condition. Everyone, by virtue of being a mortal being, experiences its effect in some way. However, we do not experience this fear at the conscious level. If we did, then we wouldn't be able to function. We couldn't be part of society, for how could we be if we were in a constant state of fear, despair and anxiety at the inevitable prospect of death? Becker references Gregory Zilborg, the Ukrainian psychoanalyst, who writes, "If this fear of death were as constantly conscious, we should be unable to function normally. It must be properly repressed to keep us living with any modicum of comfort. In other words, it is through repression that we are able to hide this fear, so that we do not live life paralysed by the fear of death. We've buried this primal fear through layers of repression and have found ways to push this fear deep into our unconscious mind. And one of the main lessons of psychoanalysis is how powerful the unconscious is in dictating our conscious life, whether that be through manipulating our desires or our very beliefs. One of the main ideas of Becker's work is that we repress this fear by creating distractions and defense mechanisms for ourselves, the two main ones being human civilization and human character. More specifically, he writes that one of the main ways we are able to repress the fear of death is mankind's common instinct for reality, a theatre for heroism. Basically, we all have some kind of urge towards this thing Becker calls heroism. The basic idea of heroism is that we create myths, we create systems of belief and practices in order to feel powerful in our world, in order to overcome the evil, the scary and the daunting prospect of death. In other words, we can feel the hero in our own mythology. We are able to distract ourselves from facing and accepting our own mortality by creating a world of meaning. For example, meaning through creating a character for ourselves, like, as he said, in theatre, with their own personality and desires, or by creating meaning through civilization, such as patriotism or tradition or culture. This meaning extends beyond our own individual selves and can last even after our deaths, providing us with a kind of pseudo-immortality. Note that by heroism, Becker does not necessarily mean that we all strive to become some kind of Superman or some kind of Greek god. We usually do it in much more discreet, subtle and socially acceptable ways. We are pressured to go about pursuing heroism in a restricted, controlled and civilized way. Becker writes that one of the first things a child has to do is to learn to abandon ecstasy, to do without awe, because we understand that if the child were to give in to the overpowering character of reality and experience, they would not be able to act in the world with the kind of equanimity we need in our non-instinctive world. So now we can better understand Becker's description of these character defences that we build up to repress the fear of death. He writes, he uses all kinds of techniques which we call the character defences. He learns not to expose himself, not to stand out. He learns to embed himself in other power, both of concrete persons and of things and cultural commands. The result is that he comes to exist in the imagined infallibility of the world around him. He doesn't have to have fears when his feet are solidly mired and his life mapped out in a ready-made maze. All he has to do is to plunge ahead in a compulsive style of drivenness in the ways of the world that the child learns and in which he lives later as a kind of grim equanimity. The strange power of living in the moment and ignoring and forgetting, as James puts it. Becker writes that it doesn't matter whether the cultural hero system is frankly magical, religious and primitive or secular, scientific and civilized. It is still a mythical hero system. in which people serve in order to earn a feeling of primary value, of cosmic specialness, and of ultimate usefulness to creation, of unshakable meaning. So the cultural hero system provides us with a feeling of security, stability, and self-worth by allowing us to not face the fear of death directly and head-on. These systems and the games inherent within them offer perfect ways to distract ourselves from the terror of our own mortality. What these systems and games, like the stock market, like chasing wealth and trying to climb the corporate ladder, what these allow us to do is to create our own stress and anxieties about these very games so that we don't have to face the more primary, more fundamental anxiety of our mortality and our own contingency. So we can stress as much as we like about struggling to get that next promotion, or worrying about the next stock market crash, or the hardships of being an entrepreneur. Also, we don't have to face our own more primary and deep-rooted anxiety and fear over the inevitability of our own death. Becker writes on this that, even in our flirtations with anxiety, we are unconscious of our motives. We seek stress, we push our own limits, but we do it with our screen against despair and not with despair itself. We do it with the stock market, with sports cars, with atomic missiles, with the success ladder in the corporation or the competition in the university. Even in our passions, we are just nursery children playing with toys that represent the real world. We occupy ourselves with these things to get the security we need, but they restrict our freedom. We are bound by them. But the fact that they restrict us in some way actually adds to their appeal for us. Heidegger helps us understand why this is when we look at his concept of despair. Heidegger argued that the basic anxiety of man is anxiety about being in the world, as well as anxiety of being in the world. That is both fear of death and fear of life, of experience and individuation. In other words, a fear of the awe and ecstasy that we spoke about earlier, the type that the child learns to repress from an early age. So the fact that these cultural systems restrict us in some way is actually appealing to us, as we fear true individuation. We allow ourselves to progress and reach high levels, but we prefer to do this in a controlled and sterile way, for example, in the corporate world, and are afraid to progress to the higher, more genuine and authentic ways of living described by Maslow's theory of self-actualization, and even going further to self-transcendence. But Maslow did understand this fear that we all have quite well. He wrote, "We fear our highest possibility, as well as our lowest ones. We are generally afraid to become that which we can glimpse in our most perfect moments. We enjoy and even thrill to the godlike possibilities we see in ourselves in such peak moments, and yet we simultaneously shiver with weakness, awe and fear before these very same possibilities. One of our problems is that we lack courage and settle for less. We end up settling for a mediocre life already set out for us. We struggle to open ourselves to the totality of existence and creating our own authentic meaning." Important to note is that Becker does suggest a possible way to break out of the mediocrity of some of our cultural heroic systems. He encapsulates this well in the final part of chapter 5. He writes, "Man breaks through the bounds of merely cultural heroism. He destroys the lie that had him perform as a hero in the everyday social scheme of things, and by doing so he opens himself up to infinity, to the possibility of cosmic heroism, to the very service of God. He links his secret inner self, his authentic talent, his deepest feelings of uniqueness, his inner yearning for absolute significance, to the very grounds of creation." Becker goes on to speak highly of faith as a much more powerful, authentic and fulfilling form of heroism, and is drawn towards Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith solution to our existential predicament. The Knight of Faith, according to Becker, is the man who lives in faith, who has given over the meaning of life to his creator, and who lives centered on the energies of his maker. He accepts whatever happens in this visible dimension without complaint, lives his life as a duty, faces his death without qualm. No pettiness is so petty that it threatens his meanings. No task is too frightening to be beyond his courage. He is fully in the world on its terms and wholly beyond the world in his trust in the invisible dimension. The Knight of Faith, then, represents what we might call an ideal of mental health, the continuing openness of life out of the death throes of dread. Due to the secularization of the modern day, we are experiencing a true crisis of heroism, and we are no longer able to appreciate the importance of faith and its potential as an effective form of cosmic heroism. This video is the first part of a multi-part series, so we will be returning to these details in much more depth shortly, specifically the idea of the modern crisis of heroism. Thank you for watching. I hope you found the video useful, and do leave any questions or comments you have down below. Thanks again, and see you in the next video. Goodbye.